The day my life turned into a courtroom drama started like any other Tuesday. I was sipping my morning coffee, scrolling through my phone, when I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "I know you have my car. I want it back, now." I blinked, wondering if I was still half asleep. What car? The only car I owned was the beat-up 1967 Chevy Impala my grandfather had left me when he passed away 6 months ago. It wasn't much to look at, but it ran like a dream and held a lot of sentimental value for me. I ignored the text, figuring it was a wrong number, but 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. "Don't ignore me. I know who you are, Jake Thompson. That Impala is mine. Give it back or I'm calling the police." Now I was wide awake. How did this person know my name? And why were they claiming my grandpa's car belonged to them? I decided to respond, hoping to clear up what had to be a misunderstanding. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person. The only car I own was inherited from my grandfather. It's not for sale or up for grabs. Please don't contact me again." I thought that would be the end of it. Boy, was I wrong? Not 5 minutes later, my phone started ringing. The same number? Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello? Listen here, you little thief." A shrill voice screeched through the phone. I had to hold it away from my ear. "That car belongs to me. Your grandfather promised it to me years ago." I felt my temper rising. Who was this woman? And why was she insulting my grandfather's memory? "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but that car was left to me in my grandfather's will. It's legally mine. Please stop harassing me." "Harassing you?" she shrieked. "I'm Karen Wilkins, and I was your grandfather's neighbor for 20 years. He always said he'd leave me that car when he passed. You must have manipulated him into changing his will." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Ms. Wilkins, I'm sorry, but that's not true. My grandfather never mentioned you, and the car was left to me fair and square. I'm hanging up now. Please don't contact me again." I ended the call and blocked the number, my hands shaking slightly. What the hell just happened? I'd never heard of this Karen person before, and I couldn't imagine my kind, honest grandfather promising his prized Impala to some random neighbor. I tried to put it out of my mind as I got ready for work. I'm a high school history teacher, and I had a big test to give my juniors that day. I didn't have time for crazy car ladies and their delusions. But as I walked out to my driveway, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, right next to my grandfather's Impala, stood a woman who looked to be in her late 50s. She had a severe blonde bob haircut and was wearing a painfully bright yellow pantsuit. Her arms were crossed, and she was glaring at me like I'd just kicked her puppy. "You," she shouted, pointing a bony finger at me. "Hand over those keys right now." I groaned internally. This had to be Karen. "Ms. Wilkins, I presume?" I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I told you on the phone, this car belongs to me. It was left to me in my grandfather's will. Now please leave my property before I call the police." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. "You ungrateful little brat? I was friends with your grandfather for years. He promised me this car. I deserve it more than you do." I unlocked the car door, ignoring her ranting. "Ma'am, I'm leaving for work now. If you're still here when I get back, I will be contacting law enforcement. Have a nice day." As I started to get into the car, she lunged forward and grabbed my arm. "You can't do this. I'll sue you. I'll take you to court." I jerked my arm away from her, shocked at her audacity. "Go ahead and try," I snapped, my patience finally wearing thin. "But touch me again, and I'll press charges for assault." I slammed the car door and peeled out of my driveway, leaving Karen sputtering and yelling on my lawn. As I drove to work, my mind was reeling. Who was this woman? Why was she so convinced the car should be hers? And would she really try to sue me? I pushed the thoughts aside as I pulled into the school parking lot. I had a job to do, and I couldn't let this craziness distract me from my students. The day passed in a blur of test papers and lesson plans. By the time the final bell rang, I'd almost managed to convince myself that the morning's events had been some kind of bizarre dream. But as I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Mike. "Dude, why is there a crazy lady sitting on your front porch?" I groaned out loud. This couldn't be happening. I typed back quickly. "Long story. That's Karen. She thinks Grandpa's car belongs to her. Can you get her to leave?" Mike's response was almost immediate. "On it. Want me to call the cops?" I hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Not yet. Let me talk to her one more time. I'll be home in 20. The drive home felt like it took hours. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I saw Mike standing on the sidewalk, looking uncomfortable. Karen was still there, perched on my porch steps like some kind of demented garden gnome. I took a deep breath and got out of the car. "Ms. Wilkins," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and authoritative, "I told you this morning to leave my property. Why are you still here?" She stood up, smoothing her garish yellow pantsuit. "I'm not leaving until you give me what's rightfully mine," she declared, chin jutting out stubbornly. "Your grandfather promised me that car, and I intend to have it." Mike stepped forward, looking concerned. "Lady, I don't know who you are, but you can't just camp out on someone's porch and demand their stuff. That's not how this works." Karen's head whipped around to glare at Mike. "Stay out of this, you millennial," she spat. "This is between me and the car thief here." I felt my temper flaring again. "I am not a thief," I said firmly. This car was left to me in my grandfather's will. I have the paperwork to prove it. Now, for the last time, please leave my property before I'm forced to call the police." She narrowed her eyes at me. "Fine," she hissed. "But this isn't over. I'm going to take you to court, and I'm going to win. That car will be mine." With that, she stomped off down the sidewalk, her yellow pantsuit a painful blur in the afternoon sun. Mike turned to me, his eyebrows raised. "Dude, what the hell was that all about?" I sighed, suddenly feeling exhausted. "I have no idea, man. She showed up this morning claiming Grandpa promised her the Impala. I've never even heard of her before today." Mike shook his head. "That's wild. You don't think she'd really try to sue you, do you?" I shrugged, unlocking my front door. "I hope not, but who knows? She seems pretty unhinged. Want a beer?" We spent the next couple of hours dissecting the bizarre situation, but neither of us could make sense of it. Mike left around 8, and I tried to distract myself with grading papers and watching TV. Just as I was getting ready for bed, my phone pinged with an email notification. The subject line made my stomach drop. "Legal notice. Lawsuit filed. Wilkins versus Thompson." "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, opening the email with shaking hands. It was from a local law firm, informing me that Karen Wilkins had indeed filed a lawsuit against me, claiming rightful ownership of my grandfather's Chevy Impala. I sat down heavily on my bed, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. How could she possibly think she had a case? I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but the thought of going to court made me feel sick to my stomach. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as I imagined worst-case scenarios. By the time my alarm went off the next morning, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I called in sick to work for the first time in years. I needed to figure out what to do. My first call was to my parents, who were just as baffled as I was. "Karen Wilkins?" my mom repeated, sounding confused. "I don't remember your grandfather ever mentioning her, and I certainly never heard anything about him promising her his car." "I know, Mom," I sighed, rubbing my temples. "It's crazy, but she's actually suing me over it." "Oh, honey," my mom said softly. "Don't worry. We'll help you fight this. That car is yours, fair and square." After reassuring my parents that I'd keep them updated, I made my next call to a lawyer friend of mine from college, Sarah. "Jake?" she answered, sounding surprised. "It's been ages. What's up?" I explained the situation as quickly and clearly as I could. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Wow," Sarah finally said. That's quite a story. Look, Jake, I mainly do corporate law, but I can recommend a great civil litigation attorney. His name is David Chen, and he's handled some pretty wild cases. Want me to give him a call for you?" I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "That would be amazing, Sarah. Thank you so much." She promised to have David contact me soon, and we hung up. I spent the rest of the morning pacing around my house, alternating between anger at Karen's audacity and anxiety about the impending legal battle. Around noon, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Hello, this is Jake Thompson," I answered hesitantly. "Mr. Thompson, this is David Chen," a warm, professional voice replied. "Sarah briefed me on your situation. I'd like to meet with you as soon as possible to discuss your case. Are you available this afternoon?" We arranged to meet at his office at 3 p.m. I spent the intervening hours gathering every scrap of paperwork I could find related to my grandfather's will and the car's ownership. David's office was in a sleek downtown high-rise. As I sat in the plush waiting room, clutching my folder of documents, I felt distinctly out of place in my jeans and t-shirt. But David himself, when he came out to greet me, immediately put me at ease. He was a man in his early 40s with a kind face and a reassuring smile. "Mr. Thompson," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Please come in." Once we were settled in his office, David got right down to business. "So, tell me everything from the beginning," he said, leaning forward attentively. I recounted the whole bizarre tale, from Karen's first text to her appearance at my house to the lawsuit notification. David listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "Well, Mr. Thompson, based on what you've told me, I don't think Ms. Wilkins has much of a case, but we'll need to approach this carefully. Can I see the documents you brought?" I handed over my folder, and David spent several minutes examining each paper closely. Finally, he looked up at me with a smile. "This is very good, Mr. Thompson. The will is clear and legally sound, and all the ownership transfer paperwork for the car is in order. Ms. Wilkins would need some pretty compelling evidence to challenge this." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. "So you think we can win this?" David nodded confidently. "I'd say our chances are excellent, but I want you to be prepared. Lawsuits like this can be stressful and time-consuming. Are you ready for that?" I took a deep breath and nodded. I have to be. That car was my grandfather's pride and joy. I can't let some entitled stranger take it away. "That's the spirit," David said approvingly. "Now, let's talk strategy." For the next hour, David outlined our approach to the case. We would file a motion to dismiss, arguing that Karen's claim had no legal merit. If that failed, we'd proceed to defend my ownership in court. As I left David's office, I felt a mixture of determination and anxiety. This was really happening. I was going to court to defend my inheritance against a woman I'd never even heard of until 2 days ago. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal preparations. David kept me updated on every development, and I spent countless hours going through old photos and documents, trying to find anything that might help our case. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to have made it her mission to make my life miserable. She started showing up at my school, trying to talk to my colleagues about the stolen car. I had to explain the situation to my principal, who thankfully was understanding and had Karen banned from the premises. She also took to social media, posting long rants about how I'd swindled her out of her rightful property. I had to lock down all my accounts and warn my friends and family to ignore her messages. The stress was taking its toll. I wasn't sleeping well, and I found myself constantly on edge, half expecting Karen to pop up around every corner. Finally, the day of our first court appearance arrived. As I stood outside the courthouse in my best suit, I felt like I might throw up. David met me at the entrance, looking calm and collected in a sharp navy suit. "Ready?" he asked, giving me an encouraging smile. I nodded, trying to swallow my nerves. "As I'll ever be?" We made our way to the designated courtroom. As we entered, I saw Karen sitting at the plaintiff's table, still in that eye-searing yellow pantsuit. She glared at me as I walked past. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, called the court to order. "We're here today for the case of Wilkins versus Thompson," she announced. "This is a hearing on the defendant's motion to dismiss. Counselors, are you ready to proceed?" David stood. "Yes, Your Honor." David Chen for the defendant, Jake Thompson. A weaselly-looking man in an ill-fitting suit stood from Karen's table. "Ready, Your Honor." Gerald Fitch for the plaintiff, Karen Wilkins. The judge nodded. "Very well. Mr. Chen, you may present your motion." David launched into a clear, concise argument for why the case should be dismissed. He presented the will, the car's ownership documents, and emphasized that Karen had no legal claim to the vehicle. "Your Honor," he concluded, "Ms. Wilkins has presented no evidence to support her claim. This lawsuit is baseless and should be dismissed immediately." The judge turned to Karen's lawyer. "Mr. Fitch, your response?" Fitch cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, my client maintains that she had a verbal agreement with the deceased, Mr. Thompson's grandfather. We intend to present witness testimony to support this claim." I felt my heart sink. Witnesses? Who could possibly testify to this nonsense? The judge frowned. "Mr. Fitch, a verbal agreement would not supersede a legal will. Do you have any documentation to support your client's claim?" Fitch shuffled some papers. "Not at this time, Your Honor, but we're confident that once we present our witnesses, the court will see the validity of Ms. Wilkins' claim." The judge sighed. "Very well. While I'm inclined to grant the motion to dismiss, in the interest of allowing both parties to fully present their cases, I'm going to deny the motion at this time. We'll proceed to trial. Counselors, please approach for scheduling." As David went to confer with the judge and Fitch, I sat there in shock. This was really happening. We were going to trial. Karen turned in her seat to smirk at me. "Hope you're ready to hand over those keys, sweetie," she said in a sickly sweet voice. I gritted my teeth, refusing to respond to her taunts. This wasn't over yet. David returned to our table. "The trial is set for 3 weeks from today," he said quietly. "Don't worry, Jake. We've got this. But we need to be prepared for whatever witnesses she's planning to bring." As we left the courthouse, my mind was reeling. Who could Karen possibly have as witnesses? And how was I going to get through the next 3 weeks knowing this ridiculous case was hanging over my head? Little did I know, the next 3 weeks would be some of the most stressful of my life. Karen seemed to take the judge's decision not to dismiss the case as some kind of victory. She ramped up her harassment campaign, now emboldened by the upcoming trial. I started receiving daily phone calls from unknown numbers, usually just heavy breathing or muffled insults when I answered. My email inbox was flooded with messages from fake accounts, all variations on the theme of "give up the car, thief." I reported everything to David, who helped me file for a restraining order against Karen. Unfortunately, since we couldn't prove she was behind the calls and emails, the judge only barred her from coming near my home or workplace. It wasn't much, but it was something. Meanwhile, David and I worked tirelessly to build our case. We dug through years of my grandfather's financial records, looking for any mention of Karen or any large purchases that might have been related to her. We found nothing. I reached out to all of my grandfather's old friends and neighbors, asking if they remembered Karen or had ever heard him mention promising her his car. Most of them had never heard of her, and those who did remember her described her as that pushy neighbor lady who was always trying to get your grandpa to give her rides. About a week before the trial, David called me with some interesting news. "Jake, I think we might have caught a break," he said, sounding excited. I did some digging into Karen's background, and it turns out this isn't the first time she's tried something like this. My eyebrows shot up. "Really? What do you mean?" David explained that he'd found records of 2 previous lawsuits Karen had filed in neighboring counties. Both cases involved her claiming that deceased individuals had promised her valuable items, a vintage guitar in one case, and a valuable stamp collection in another. Both cases had been dismissed for lack of evidence. "This is great, Jake," David said. "It establishes a pattern of behavior. We can use this to show that Karen has a history of making false claims against estates." I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. "That's fantastic, David. Do you think it'll be enough?" It certainly helps our case, he replied. But we need to be prepared for whatever witnesses she's planning to bring. Have you had any luck finding out who they might be? I sighed. No, nothing. None of my grandfather's friends seem to know anything about it. All right, well, keep trying. And Jake, try to get some rest. You sound exhausted. He wasn't wrong. The stress was really getting to me. I'd lost weight, I wasn't sleeping well, and my students had started to notice that I wasn't my usual upbeat self in class. The night before the trial, I tossed and turned for hours before finally falling into a fitful sleep. I dreamed that I was driving my grandfather's Impala, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror, Karen was there, getting closer and closer no matter how fast I drove. I woke up in a cold sweat, my alarm blaring. This was it, trial day. I put on my best suit and tried to eat some breakfast, but my stomach was in knots. As I was about to leave, I noticed an envelope that had been slipped under my front door. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. It's not too late to do the right thing. Give me the car, and this can all go away. I crumpled the note and shoved it in my pocket. There was no way I was giving in to Karen's intimidation tactics. When I arrived at the courthouse, David was waiting for me on the steps. He took one look at my face and frowned. You okay, Jake? You look like you've seen a ghost. I showed him the note. His expression darkened. This is completely unacceptable. We'll inform the judge about this before we begin. Are you ready? I took a deep breath and nodded. As I'll ever be? We entered the courtroom to find it surprisingly full. It seemed word had gotten around about the bizarre case of the inherited car lawsuit. I spotted my parents and Mike in the gallery, giving me encouraging smiles. Karen was already at her table, still in that eye-searing yellow pantsuit. She smirked at me as I walked past. I ignored her, focusing on David's reassuring presence beside me. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge entered. It was the same judge from our previous hearing, looking just as stern as before. We're here for the case of Wilkins versus Thompson, she announced. Are both parties ready to proceed? David and Karen's lawyer, Fitch, both confirmed they were ready. Very well, the judge said. Mr. Fitch, as the plaintiff, you may present your opening statement. Fitch stood, straightening his ill-fitting jacket. Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because a promise was broken. My client, Ms. Karen Wilkins, was a dear friend and neighbor to the late Mr. Thompson for over 20 years. In recognition of their friendship and Ms. Wilkins' many kindnesses, Mr. Thompson promised to leave her his prized 1967 Chevy Impala upon his death. Yet when Mr. Thompson passed away, his grandson, the defendant, took possession of the car, ignoring his grandfather's wishes and Ms. Wilkins' rightful claim. We will prove through witness testimony that this promise was made and that the car rightfully belongs to Ms. Wilkins. Thank you. As Fitch sat down, I felt my blood boiling. How dare they paint my grandfather as some kind of promise breaker? And what witnesses could they possibly have? David squeezed my arm gently, reminding me to stay calm. Then he stood for his opening statement. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a simple case of attempted theft through false claims. The defendant, Jake Thompson, legally inherited a car from his grandfather. The car was left to him in a properly executed will, and all ownership transfer documents are in order. The plaintiff, Ms. Wilkins, has provided no evidence to support her claim of a verbal promise. Furthermore, we will show that Ms. Wilkins has a history of making similar false claims against estates. This lawsuit is nothing more than an attempt to bully and harass my client into giving up his rightful property. We ask that the court dismiss this baseless claim and award any appropriate damages to the defendant. Thank you. As David sat down, I could see Karen glaring daggers at us. The judge nodded and said, Thank you, counselors. Mr. Fitch, you may call your first witness. Fitch stood again. The plaintiff calls Ms. Gladys Perkins to the stand. An elderly woman with a walker made her way slowly to the witness stand. After she was sworn in, Fitch began his questioning. Ms. Perkins, how did you know the late Mr. Thompson? Gladys adjusted her glasses. Oh, Harold and I were neighbors for nearly 30 years. Such a kind man. And in that time, did you ever hear Mr. Thompson discuss his plans for his car after his death? Gladys nodded. Oh yes, he mentioned it a few times. He was very fond of that car, you know. I tensed up. Where was this going? Fitch continued. And what did Mr. Thompson say about the car? Gladys thought for a moment. Well, he always said he wanted it to go to someone who would appreciate it. Someone who understood its value. Fitch smiled triumphantly. And did he ever mention Ms. Wilkins in relation to the car? Gladys squinted. Ms. Wilkins? Oh, you mean Karen? Yes, I believe he did mention her once. Said something about how she was always admiring that car. No further questions, Your Honor, Fitch said, looking pleased with himself. David stood for cross-examination. Ms. Perkins, you said Mr. Thompson mentioned wanting the car to go to someone who would appreciate it. Did he ever specifically say he was leaving it to Ms. Wilkins? Gladys frowned. Well, no, not in those exact words. And in all your years of knowing Mr. Thompson, did he ever tell you he was planning to go against his will and leave the car to someone other than his grandson? No, he never said anything like that, Gladys admitted. Thank you, Ms. Perkins. No further questions. As Gladys was helped down from the stand, I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Was this really the best evidence Karen had? Fitch called his next witness, a man named Frank who had apparently been my grandfather's mechanic. Frank testified that my grandfather often brought Karen along when he came in for oil changes or repairs. She knew a lot about cars, Frank said. Mr. Thompson seemed impressed by that, said it was nice to have someone to talk shop with. But under David's cross-examination, Frank admitted that he'd never heard my grandfather say he was leaving the car to Karen. He also confirmed that I had been bringing the car in for maintenance since my grandfather's death, and that I seemed to know just as much about its care as Karen did. As the morning wore on, Karen's case seemed to get weaker and weaker. Her witnesses all seemed to amount to people who had seen her admiring the car or talking about it with my grandfather, but no one could confirm any promise or agreement to leave it to her. Finally, Fitch called his last witness, Karen herself. As Karen took the stand, she shot me a smug look that made my skin crawl. After she was sworn in, Fitch began his questioning. Ms. Wilkins, can you please describe your relationship with the late Mr. Thompson? Karen put on a sad, wistful expression. Harold was my dear friend and neighbor for over 20 years. I helped him with his gardening, drove him to doctor's appointments when he got older, and we spent countless hours working on that beautiful Impala together. I had to stop myself from scoffing out loud. This was news to me and my entire family. Fitch nodded sympathetically. And did Mr. Thompson ever discuss leaving you the car? Karen's eyes welled up with obviously fake tears. Yes, he did. It was about a year before he passed. We were working on the car together, and he turned to me and said, Karen, when I'm gone, I want you to have this car. You appreciate it just as much as I do, and I know you'll take good care of it. I felt my blood boiling. This was an outright lie. Fitch continued, and did you ever discuss this promise with anyone else? Karen nodded. I mentioned it to a few friends, yes? I was so touched by Harold's generosity. No further questions, Your Honor, Fitch said, looking satisfied. As David stood for cross-examination, I could see a glint in his eye that gave me hope. Ms. Wilkins, he began, you claim that Mr. Thompson promised you the car about a year before his death, correct? That's right, Karen said confidently. David picked up a document from our table. I have here Mr. Thompson's will, dated 6 months before his death, in which he clearly leaves the car to his grandson. Can you explain why, if he had promised you the car, he would then write a will leaving it to someone else? Karen's smug expression faltered for a moment. Well, I suppose he must have forgotten. He was getting on in years, you know. David raised an eyebrow. Forgot such an important promise? I see. Ms. Wilkins, are you aware that this isn't the first time you've claimed that a deceased person promised you valuable property? Karen's face went pale. I don't know what you mean. David approached the bench, handing some documents to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to enter these court records into evidence. They show that Ms. Wilkins has filed similar lawsuits in 2 other counties, claiming that deceased individuals had promised her valuable items. Both cases were dismissed for lack of evidence. The judge examined the documents, then nodded. I'll allow it. David turned back to Karen. Ms. Wilkins, can you explain these previous lawsuits? Karen was visibly sweating now. Those were different. This time, I'm telling the truth. Just as you were telling the truth about the vintage guitar and the stamp collection? David pressed. Karen's composure cracked. It's not fair, she burst out. I deserved that car. I was his friend for years, and then this ungrateful brat swoops in and takes it just because he's family? He probably doesn't even appreciate it. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged her gavel. Order. Ms. Wilkins, control yourself or you'll be held in contempt. David's voice was calm but firm. No further questions, Your Honor. As Karen was dismissed from the stand, looking shaken and angry, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Surely now the judge would see through her lies? The judge called for a short recess before closing arguments. As David and I stepped out of the courtroom, he gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder. I think we've got this, Jake, he said with a smile. Karen really shot herself in the foot up there. I nodded, still processing everything that had happened. I can't believe she thought she could get away with this. When we returned to the courtroom, both lawyers presented their closing arguments. Fitch tried to paint Karen as a misunderstood friend who had been promised a gift, while David emphasized the lack of evidence for Karen's claim and her history of similar false allegations. Finally, the judge cleared her throat. Having heard all the evidence presented, I'm prepared to render my verdict. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The judge continued, it's clear to this court that the plaintiff, Ms. Wilkins, has no legal claim to the vehicle in question. The will is unambiguous in leaving the car to the defendant, Mr. Thompson. Furthermore, Ms. Wilkins has failed to provide any credible evidence of a verbal agreement, and her history of similar claims casts serious doubt on her credibility. I felt a surge of relief, but the judge wasn't finished. Ms. Wilkins, I find your attempt to claim property through false allegations deeply troubling. You've wasted this court's time and caused significant distress to the defendant. I'm dismissing this case with prejudice, and I'm ordering you to pay all of Mr. Thompson's legal fees. Furthermore, I'm issuing a permanent injunction barring you from contacting Mr. Thompson or coming within 500 feet of him or the vehicle in question. Do you understand? Karen, looking shell-shocked, nodded mutely. The judge turned to me. Mr. Thompson, I apologize for the stress this frivolous lawsuit has caused you. You're free to go, and that car is unquestionably yours. As the judge banged her gavel to end the proceedings, I felt like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It was over. We'd won? David shook my hand, grinning broadly. Congratulations, Jake. Justice prevailed today. I turned to see my parents and Mike rushing over, all of them beaming. As they enveloped me in a group hug, I caught sight of Karen being led out of the courtroom, her yellow pantsuit somehow looking deflated now. Later that evening, as I sat in my grandfather's, my Impala, I felt a profound sense of peace. I ran my hand over the steering wheel, remembering all the times I'd ridden in this car with my grandfather. We did it, Grandpa, I said softly. We protected your legacy. As I started the engine, hearing that familiar purr, I knew that no matter what challenges life might throw at me in the future, I had the strength to face them head on. After all, I'd taken on a Karen in court, and won. The end. Are you hungry for more slices of stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to never miss out on any videos. See you tomorrow at Story Slices.